In the summer of 1850, the river fog rolled thick and slow over Belle Rive, a small town pressed between the languid Mississippi and the endless stretch of cypress swamps. The air smelled of salt water and rot, of magnolia blooms, and something darker, something that slipped just beneath the skin. It was on one of those muggy evenings that Clara Winslow arrived. She came not by announcement, not by fanfare, but by the simple, inevitable whisper of her presence that traveled faster than any horse or boat could. The townsfolk first saw her on the levee, a figure in pale green, her skirts brushing the reeds and her bonnet tilted just so against the sinking sun. There was an elegance to her gait, a precision in her posture, as if each step had been choreographed by a mind that saw the world in quiet geometries. Children paused mid-play, their sticks frozen in the mud. Dogs lowered their heads. Even the lazy gulls that drifted along the riverbank seemed to hesitate in the air. She spoke to no one at first. She watched. She listened. And yet, somehow, every man in her line of sight felt the heat of her attention as though it were tangible, pressing upon the chest, tightening the breath. Some said it was her eyes, a deep, unrelenting grey that seemed too still for human emotion. Others said it was her voice, though she had not yet spoken, that sounded in their minds as a promise, or perhaps a warning, carried on the damp evening air. By nightfall, Clara had been seen along the main street, entering the small inn near the ferry. The innkeeper, a stout man named Jebediah Crow, recalled later how she ordered only water and a slice of bread, yet left a coin that was heavy in gold and heavy in implication. She did not eat, she did not drink, she did not laugh. She simply moved through the world, as though the world had been arranged for her alone. Men lingered near her table, their eyes darting, their hands trembling at the sight of her silhouette under the lamplight. They claimed to see the shadows around her bend slightly, drawn toward her as if gravity had acquired taste. By morning, 2 men were missing. Neither had returned to their homes, and neither had been spoken of again in casual conversation, though the town remembered them in silence, as one remembers a name carved into the bark of a tree. Clara's days followed a pattern. She wandered the riverfront at dawn, watching the steam rise from the water and tracing the mist with her fingers, though the fog was never close enough to touch. She paused in the market, inhaled the smell of fresh bread and fish, and moved on. Her skirts never gathered dust, her shoes never left a mark. She was a living shape of contradiction, tangible, yet impossibly ethereal. The women of Belle Rive whispered in kitchens and parlors. They noticed their husbands lingering near Clara's door, lingering too long, speaking in hushed tones that seemed to belong to another world. Some said it was fascination, some said it was madness. All agreed that the air shifted when she was present, that a hush fell over the town like the first snow, though the summer sun still burned bright. She was seen sometimes on the balcony of the inn at night, staring at the moon's reflection in the river. People reported that her silhouette would stretch and warp in the lantern light, as if the darkness itself leaned toward her, trying to hear what she was thinking. Those who met her gaze claimed a sensation like falling, though no step had been taken. They could not speak, could not move, could not forget. The town's children began to tell stories of a lady in pale green who walked the riverbank at twilight. They said she could call the river fish to the shore with a glance, make the frogs cease their croaking, and bend the wind around her like a ribbon. At night, they whispered to one another that those who dared to meet her too closely might vanish, just as the 2 men had disappeared. Mothers hushed them with trembling hands, but the stories persisted, and the children's eyes glimmered with a mixture of fear and awe. By the end of the first month, Clara had secured lodgings in an abandoned cottage on the outskirts of town. It had once belonged to a planter who had left for the northern states, leaving the shutters open and the paint blistered by sun and rain. No one saw her enter. She simply appeared within the walls, and in the morning, smoke rose from the chimney, as though the house itself had drawn her in. Windows remained closed, curtains still, yet from the road, passers-by swore they saw movement, shadows that shifted with intention, the flicker of candlelight reflected on walls that should have been. Dark merchants reported that items went missing from their shops, always minor things. A spool of thread, a loaf of bread, a silver spoon, yet no theft was ever confirmed, for when one searched, the objects were gone, as though the town itself had swallowed them. Some swore it was Clara, though others would not speak her name aloud. She became a presence in Belle Rive, the center of a silent gravity, bending the behavior of all around her without ever lifting a hand. By midsummer, the river itself seemed to change. The fog lingered longer in the mornings, and the cypress swamps exhaled a heavier, wetter scent. Men began disappearing with quiet regularity. The innkeeper, Jebediah Crow, claimed he had seen them speaking to her along the pier, leaning close, as if whispering secrets into the dusk. Afterward, they were not seen again. Boats returned empty, footsteps fell silent, and the town's nights were punctuated by the distant sound of water lapping against unseen hulls. Despite this, Clara remained untouchable, unapproachable. She dined with the town's most prominent families, yet her seat was always slightly apart, her posture perfect, her expression indifferent. Children left her bouquets of wildflowers. Servants laid plates in her path. Men fell into silence when she smiled faintly, a smile that suggested both invitation and warning. Nothing in Belle Rive was her doing, and yet everything seemed to bend around her. It was said that she could sit in the town square for hours, barely moving, and the very light would shift. The sun dimming slightly, the shadows tilting unnaturally, the air thickening as though it had grown a consciousness. Birds would stop singing, dogs would lower their heads, and those who approached too closely would feel the pull of something unseen, a gravity that was neither moral nor mortal, but simply there, waiting. No one knew where she came from. Some claimed she was the daughter of a wealthy New Orleans family who had lost everything in the hurricanes of 1849. Others whispered of French blood, of estates abandoned across the swamps, of forbidden rituals in the shadowed halls of plantations now rotting. Clara never confirmed a word. She moved like water over stone, shaping herself around the town, yet never dissolving, never melting into the world, always separate, always observing. And then, inevitably, the first reports of the missing men arrived at the small parish church. Fathers, sons, workers who had gone to the river or to the fields or to the market were simply gone. No search yielded results. The fog and swamp seemed to conspire with the air itself, hiding them, erasing their paths, leaving only hushed murmurs in taverns and homes. And always, the faint, pale green figure of Clara Winslow lingering at the edges of vision, like a lighthouse that draws you in, but whose light you cannot touch. By autumn, Belle Rive had changed. The town's rhythm slowed, constrained by a quiet terror. Windows were shuttered earlier, lamps lit sooner. The women spoke in whispers of Clara's beauty, her stillness, the magnetic pull that men could not resist. The children learned to avoid the levee, and the fishermen moved their boats further out, wary of the edge of the fog where Clara had been seen. And through it all, Clara remained. She walked the town in the heat and the rain, along the riverbank at dawn, across the fields at dusk. She was always alone, yet never solitary. Men lingered near her presence, eyes distant, voices hushed. Women scowled, whispered, and sometimes prayed quietly. The air thickened wherever she went, carrying with it the sense that time itself had bent to her arrival. By winter, The last whispers of that first summer had turned into legend. 2 men remained unspoken of in any casual conversation. Several more had disappeared. Belle Reeve grew quiet, and Clara Winslow, whose presence had arrived like a ripple across still water, stood at the heart of it, unmoved, serene, a figure, in pale green, watching the world bend around her without effort, without malice, without acknowledgement. No one could say what she would do next. And yet, deep in the town, the knowledge lingered, unspoken, unavoidable, and absolute, that, once Clara Winslow had walked among them, nothing would ever return to the way it had been. Spring came slowly to Belle Reeve, with a hesitation that mirrored the town's own unease. The cypress trees dripped with moss that swayed like half-remembered ghosts, and the river carried a chill long after the sun had promised warmth. By then, Clara Winslow had become a fixture of the town, though no one could rightly say how or why. She did not work, she did not trade, she did not answer to any neighbor, yet her presence filled the streets like a slow, omnipresent tide. It was during this season, the townsfolk whispered, that the red lilies bloomed. No one had planted them. They appeared overnight along the riverbank and the edges of Clara's small cottage, their petals deep and almost liquid in the morning light. Some swore the flowers leaned toward her as she walked by, bending in quiet reverence, their scent rising in waves of honey and rust. Others claimed that the river carried their fragrance upstream, reaching those who dared to leave town, reminding them insistently of Belle Reeve, of her. Clara's daily movements became an unspoken ritual observed by every watcher who dared linger. She would rise before dawn, walking the misty edges of the river where the water licked at the mud with a slow persistence. Men who glimpsed her in the fog claimed she moved in silence, her skirts untouched by dew or dirt, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the horizon, as if conversing with something hidden beneath the waves. When she spoke, it was never more than a breath, a syllable, yet it carried weight. Laughter, suggestion, command, all in the tremor of a single note. At mid-morning she appeared in the town square, where the women sold produce and the children played beneath the shadows of oaks. Clara would linger at the fountain, her reflection shimmering in the water, untouched by wind or leaf, her hands brushing the air as if she could pluck the very essence of the day from the sunlit squares. Men paused in their work, their eyes drawn involuntarily. Horses slowed in their steps. Even the river, wide and indifferent, seemed to hold its breath as she moved along the cobblestones. The social gatherings began subtly. Clara attended Sunday markets, lending her hand to guide the elderly or to accept bouquets from the timid children who dared approach. But these gestures carried no warmth. She offered no comfort, no companionship beyond the briefest contact. Yet the men around her, shopkeepers, boatmen, sons of planters, hung on her slightest acknowledgement. Those who brushed shoulders with her seemed changed, their eyes distant, their speech uncertain, their movements slowed as if pulled by an invisible current. The red lilies bloomed in increasing abundance, marking the edges of Clara's influence. She planted none of them, touched none of them, and yet they grew in abundance around her path. The townsfolk took to calling this season the season of red lilies, though none dared speak the words too loudly, as if acknowledging the flowers aloud might summon their bloom into reality. Even the children knew to whisper, to avert their eyes, when the petals quivered in her presence. Clara's evenings were the most memorable, the most unsettling. She would drift along the riverbank in the amber light of sunset, stopping at points where the water ran deep and the reeds swayed tall. Men followed quietly, hoping to glimpse a word, a gesture, a sign that might explain the pull they felt toward her. None returned unchanged. Some spoke of dreams afterward, impossible dreams of quiet rooms filled with mirrors reflecting themselves in her eyes, of hands they did not recognize reaching for objects they had never seen. Others vanished, their absence a silent punctuation in the town's rhythm. The women of Belle Rive were not idle observers. They watched from windows, behind shutters, from kitchens and porches. They whispered in their parlors, sewing, cooking, praying. Some attempted to speak with Clara, to question, to guide her away from their husbands, but she received them with the same unflinching stillness she brought to all things. Their words fell against her like water on stone. She nodded politely, her lips curling faintly, a motion that suggested acknowledgement but delivered nothing further. Rumors spread faster than the red lilies themselves. Some claimed Clara had been educated in New Orleans, tutored in languages and music, steeped in books no one could name. Others said she had grown up in the French quarters, where shadows lingered too long and no one dared look behind doors. A few swore she was not entirely human, that the pull she exerted on men and the bloom of lilies was unnatural. Yet no one could prove any of this. All they could do was whisper and watch. The town's children became both witnesses and chroniclers. They drew pictures in mud, showing Clara's form among lilies taller than themselves, her bonnet a shadow in the waning sun. They told stories of how she could pause the river's movement with a glance, how the wind would curl around her hair, like a living thing. At night, their parents hushed them, claiming such talk invited misfortune, but still the tales persisted, growing richer and darker with each telling. Clara's presence altered the landscape of Belle Rive itself. Windows were shuttered earlier. Paths along the river were abandoned in favor of streets that curved away from her cottage. Men avoided her when necessary, but inevitably returned, drawn by the quiet pull they could not name. Horses whinnied uneasily in her vicinity. Dogs refused to pass her gate. Even the river, swollen from spring rains, seemed to hesitate at her reflection, ripples holding longer than they should, as if the water recognized her authority. At social gatherings, Clara's influence was subtle yet undeniable. She attended dinners and small dances, never entering a room without shifting the energy within it. Conversation faltered, laughter softened. Gazes followed her regardless of where she walked. Men's hands shook, voices cracked. Women tensed, their eyes darting, their fingers brushing nervously against one another. And yet, despite all this, Clara was composed, serene, untouched by tension or expectation. She moved as though Belle Rive had been constructed for her observation alone, a stage upon which her figure could glide unimpeded. By the end of spring, the town had changed irrevocably. The red lilies had multiplied, carpeting the edges of streets, gardens and riverbanks. Men walked with slower steps, eyes distant, voices hesitant. Women spoke in hushed tones of Clara's beauty, her silence, the invisible tether that drew their husbands toward her presence. Children avoided the river at dawn, knowing instinctively that the fog held her there, waiting. Clara herself remained, a mystery. She did not age noticeably over those weeks. Her skin was pale but unblemished, her eyes unchanged, her hair unruffled by the wind. Some claimed she could be seen walking at midnight along the levee, though the moon was hidden behind clouds, and her figure glowed faintly in the fog, an apparition among the reeds. Others swore the lilies bloomed even in darkness, following her path, their petals opening to her touch, though no hand had moved to coax them. It was during the height of the season that Clara ventured deeper into Belle Rive's hidden spaces. Abandoned warehouses, overgrown gardens, the edges of the swamp where the land gave way to water. Men followed, quietly, cautiously, as if drawn by invisible strings. They glimpsed her skirts brushing the water, her reflection still and perfect. Her gaze fixed on a point beyond sight. Some returned with tales of strange sensations, a heaviness in the chest, a cold wind that carried the scent of lilies, a whisper of something unspoken that lingered in the mind long after she had moved on. Others did not return at all, and, still, Clara did nothing that could be named malicious. She did not shout, she did not strike, she did not command. She simply moved through the world, and the world in turn shifted around her. The red lilies, the river, the fog, the very air of Belle Reve, all bent to her presence, shaping themselves subtly, invisibly, around her being. By summer, the town had grown silent in her wake. Conversations were muted, steps were slower, glances lingered too long. The red lilies had become so pervasive that travelers entering Belle Reve could not pass without brushing against them, without inhaling their scent, without feeling the faint pull that Clara seemed to emanate. Men no longer laughed freely, women no longer spoke boldly, and children no longer played near the levee at dawn. All felt the presence of something greater, something inhuman in its quiet insistence, that watched from pale green skirts and grey eyes. Clara Winslow, serene and untouchable, had become the heart of Belle Reve. And as the river swelled with the summer rains, as the fog thickened and the air grew heavy with scent, the town knew, unspoken, undeniable, that they had not merely been visited. They had been observed, measured, bent to a pattern they could never understand, and that pattern was hers alone. By the time the leaves turned in the late autumn of 1851, Clara Winslow had claimed the old plantation house at the edge of the bayou. Its shutters hung crooked, its paint peeled like sunburned skin, and the surrounding land was a tangle of reeds and willows. No one saw her enter. No one saw her unpack or settle. One morning she simply stood on the veranda, pale in the amber light, and the town knew with a certainty they did not question that she had taken residence. The house itself seemed to bend to her presence. Doors that had groaned for decades now opened silently. Windows, once cracked and dusty, reflected her image as if polished. The air within smelled faintly of lilies, damp earth, and something indefinable, a perfume that carried both allure and unease. Locals whispered that the bayou itself had grown calmer in her vicinity, its surface smoothing to mirror her figure, though the waters elsewhere churned with the usual unseen currents. Clara did not invite visitors, yet the town's men, compelled by a curiosity that had long since merged with desire, found themselves lingering near the gate, pretending to fish along the bank or tending to tasks that required proximity. They glimpsed her in fleeting moments, a pale sleeve brushing the UAS railing, a glance toward the horizon that seemed to draw them inward, toward the impossible calm of her gaze. Those who watched too long felt the days stretch unnaturally, their thoughts entangled in a web they could not name. The red lilies multiplied. They sprang from the waterlogged ground like flames of quiet warning, clustering along the edges of the house, climbing the veranda steps, crowding the windowsills. By winter, the bloom had become so dense that no pathway to the house remained clear. Visitors who attempted to approach reported that the flowers bent subtly, not with the wind, but with her movement inside. They seemed almost to whisper, and the townsfolk who observed from a distance shivered as if hearing a language just beyond comprehension. Clara's routines remained unchanged. Dawn found her walking the levee, her skirts undisturbed by mud or dew, her eyes fixed beyond the horizon. Men shadowed her movements, drawn silently, their steps hesitant and slow. The river fog seemed to rise in acknowledgement of her presence, curling around her like a protective veil. In the afternoons, she wandered the outskirts of the town, through gardens overrun with vines, past empty barns, her figure drifting through the light and shadow with a grace that was almost unnatural. Evenings were spent on the veranda, watching. The bayou reflect the dying sun. Ships and rafts passed far below, unaware of the hush that fell over the house, the flowers, the water, the very air. Her silhouette, pale and perfect, moved against the horizon with a stillness that was almost unworldly. The townsfolk whispered in their homes, saying that she could stop the wind, that she could still the current of the river, that she could command attention without a single word. Children continued to leave small offerings at the edge of the bayou, wildflowers, pebbles, a tiny woven basket, and she accepted them silently, touching none, moving nothing. But the offerings remained in place longer than they should, unnaturally preserved, as if the earth itself recognized her attention. Some children claimed that at night, when the fog was thickest, the lilies glowed faintly in her presence, casting a spectral red light across the water, and that Clara's eyes reflected that glow in ways that made the heart pound. The men who lingered near her home grew quieter still. Their eyes, once bright with curiosity or mischief, became distant. Some disappeared entirely, vanishing into the bayou, into the darkened fields, into the thickening fog. Others remained, changed irrevocably, walking the streets of Belle Rive. In a trance-like state, their words clipped, their attention fractured, their minds tethered to something unseen. All who had been touched by her presence felt it, recognized it, feared it, yet could not bring themselves to leave. Clara never intervened directly. She did not call, command, or threaten. She simply moved through her house, through the grounds, through the town's consciousness, and the world responded. The river slowed for her, the wind softened, the lilies grew redder. The bayou held its secrets with newfound care. It was as though she existed in a space slightly removed from reality, a current running just beneath the surface of the visible world, felt but never fully comprehended. By the second winter, the town had adapted to her presence, though not comfortably. Windows were shuttered tightly, doors locked against the chill and the unseen pull she exerted. Children were kept close. Men walked with their heads lowered, their movements precise, measured. And yet, every observer knew she was there, moving silently, appearing briefly at dusk along the veranda, her reflection shimmering on the water's edge, her skirts pale against the shadow of the cypress. No one questioned her origin. No one pressed her for explanations. She had arrived like a ripple and had grown into a tide, reshaping the town around her with quiet insistence. The older women of Belle Rive whispered that she had been born to privilege and refinement, that her beauty and calm were weapons honed in the salons of New Orleans. Others said she was not entirely human, that the lilies, the river, the fog itself obeyed her because they recognized something beyond mortality. None of it could be proven, and all of it was spoken only in hushed tones. The town's landscape mirrored the change in its people. Paths were altered by the red lilies. The riverbank became a place of awe and unease. Barns and cottages that had been visible from the levee were now hidden in the thickening growth, veiled by her influence. Those who traveled to Belle Rive briefly spoke of a beauty so overwhelming, so quiet, that it seemed to seep into their bones. And all who left carried the memory like a fragrance, haunting and irresistible. As years passed, Clara remained unchanged. Her hair, her skin, her eyes, all were untouched by time, untouched by the heat and humidity of the Louisiana summers or the cold snaps that occasionally brushed the river. The town aged around her. Men grew old and pale, women tired, children grew into adults, and the bayou shifted with the seasons. Yet Clara's presence remained a constant, a fixed point of grace and terror that the air itself seemed to honor. The house by the bayou became a symbol, though no one dared call it such aloud. It was a landmark in silence, a measure of the inexplicable power she exerted. Boats passed more cautiously near the edge of the water. Fishermen avoided the reeds closest to her veranda, and townsfolk, moving about their days, kept a careful distance, acknowledging her presence with bowed heads and subtle gestures. All understood that she was the center of a force they could neither name nor resist. By the spring of 1855, Clara's influence was complete. The town had bent entirely around her presence. Men walked slower, women spoke softer, children approached the bayou only in the earliest light. The red lilies had spread to every corner of her property and beyond, a vibrant living sign of the hold she had on Belle Reve. The river, the fog, the wind, the swamp, all seemed aware of her, responsive to her slightest motion. Yet she remained inscrutable, serene, unhurried. Her beauty was undiminished, her grace unaltered. No one could touch her, influence her, or sway her will. She existed simply, fully, a being out of step with the mortal world, yet entirely present, shaping everything around her with the quiet certainty of inevitability. In the end, the legend of Clara Winslow became inseparable from Belle Reve itself. The town, the river, the bayou, and the red lilies all held memory of her presence. Travelers spoke of a house by the bayou, a woman in pale green, a stillness that could be felt across the water, and those who lingered too long, who watched too closely, understood, though they rarely spoke it, that once Clara Winslow had entered a town, nothing could ever return to the way it had been. She remained as she had from the first day, untouched by time, unbent by circumstance, a figure of ethereal command. Observing quietly from the edge of the bayou, where the water met the lilies, and where the town itself learned to bend in her absence, even as she was ever present. Clara Winslow, the woman who came like fog and stayed like legend, remained at the heart of Belle Reve. And the red lilies, blooming eternally along the river's edge, were the only measure of the quiet, inescapable power she carried.